Yeah. Oh, just a minute.
Okay.
Just for me. Yeah.
Let's throw those over. Yeah.
I think it's old news.
Okay, go.
All ready? Very good. Hi, my name is Andy Schwartz. I'd like to welcome everyone who's here today at Record Grouch on lovely Manhattan Avenue in Brooklyn, Greenpoint, Brooklyn. And today I'm going to have a conversation with Joe Carducci, a veteran of the independent music scene going back to the mid-1970s, as well as the author of multiple books and 3 collections of his original screenplays. Joe, welcome to town.
Thanks, Andy.
And I'm going to, for those who may or may not be familiar with my background or Joe's, the reason I'm here and the reason Joe asked me to participate today is because although I was not the founder, let me, Elle, would you hand me the magazine? I was not the founder of New York Rocker magazine, which was founded in the spring of 1976 by my good friend Alan Betrock, but I became publisher and editor after I assumed ownership from him at the end of 77. So I was publisher and editor from, let's say, the end of 77, beginning of 78, issue number 11, through issue number 54, which came out in the fall of 82. That was the last one. Some of you, people who are really into the obscure, may remember that a year or perhaps a year and a half later, after my version of the magazine folded for good, there was actually a restart under another owner, another publisher and editor, which ran for maybe three or four issues and was in a different format, like a standard magazine format, not the tabloid, and which I really had nothing to do with. I don't really have anything to say about it. Today, of course, the original issues of New York Rocker can sometimes go for a pretty penny because, for one thing, very little of the content has ever appeared on the web. That part of the content which has been digitized and posted is most often found on a subscription site based in London that I'm sure many of you may be familiar with, called Rock's Back Pages, founded by Barney Hoskins, the veteran British music journalist and author, and some of his cohorts. And that is really the most important and deepest archive of popular music journalism that we have on the internet today. So in that instance, the individual contributors to the magazine did their own deals with Rock's Back Pages, but as in my case and everybody else's, only the text appears. There's no original graphics, no accompanying photos, and so forth. Just the text. But Joe asked me to participate today because I did. I was publisher and editor of this magazine for those important years, and later on I was in band management for a couple of years, and I worked for 12 years for Epic Records, which was a division of Sony Music. I worked in the publicity department, and I worked with everybody from Eazy-E to Rage Against the Machine, Cyndi Lauper, and Sade. I mean, it was a conveyor belt of artists that, and my part of the job was like on that conveyor belt, So interesting times to work at a major is my only job with a major label, or for that matter, a major corporation. So Joe asked me to be here today, and he, of course, began his career in the mid-1970s with independent distribution, independent record distribution, and a label, am I right, Joe, that came out of Systematic, Thermidor?
Yeah, I mean, the distribution was the first project. But I asked you because you've read all my books.
I have read
That's very rare. You and Roger.
those that I have not actually read in full or on the ever expanding to read list. I did most recently read one of Joe's screenplays called Unsolved from his collection Chicago Stories. I could see the movie. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was very well done. I'm no expert when it comes to reading screenplays or the making of movies or anything like that, but I really feel that he had achieved what he set out to do in writing scripts like this. I also reread portions of Joe's originally published 1990 Rock and the Pop Narcotic, and if you really want to stroll down memory lane, check out Rock and the Pop Narcotic, because it's really it really captures a time, a place, and a subculture that might still exist in some form, and we can get into that today. So Joe's going to talk a little bit more about his other involvements and gigs.
Well, yeah, it was the rock book is in a way from a time before the internet, where, you know, if you know what to ask the internet, you can listen to almost anything. There was very little literature in the 80s in book form. You didn't quite have the superstores to even stock, you know, music books. Tower had just become a national chain, which that was too late really to help selling records while I was at SST. Tower was very important on the West Coast. They didn't get to Chicago until 88, 89, and then they were coast to coast at that point. And that hurt, you know, X, that hurt Black Flag, that hurt, you know, they knew how to sell. They could treat a major independent release like a major label release. They would put a stack on the floor. In LA, that was how they treated Gun Club or X albums, Adolescence later on.
And Joe, in the book, you actually say if the rest of the country had had a level of activity and exposure comparable to Los Angeles retail, X first two albums would have been gold records.
Yeah. And that was independent-wise. And same with Damaged, I think. It was a phenomenon. And Greg Ginn's entire plan was, with the Unicorn label, was that it had MCA distribution, and Black Flag had the name and the you know, the oral and visual impact, and they were going to be touring. So he didn't think MCA had to know anything about the record. Just get it in a mall shop, and some teenager would recognize what it was. This is a little before skateboarding almost became the vehicle for a band like the Descendants to, you know, skateboarding videotapes, soundtracks for that kind of stuff. That was a little bit after this early period in '81, but the LA press was more responsive to the local scene, in particular the LA Times that Robert Hilburn ran, and he hired writers and they covered shows, and they had record reviews and they had news columns. So there was nothing like that in Chicago. CBGB's here. The bands that were important got isolated notices in the New York Times. I don't know about the other papers. The Village Voice was important.
Yeah, I think more consistently in the Voice, Joe.
So the Times, would they review the Ramones each time there was a record? Or?
I think that varied. I don't know that could be relied on each time, As you pointed out, one of the most consistent, to this day, still turning me on to like some pretty hip shit, was Robert Christgau in The Voice. And in Rock and the Pop Narcotic, Joe, in your discussion of the rock press, you talk about how Christgau's almost his entire focus is on the records and being really comprehensive. Like he was actually discussing and assigning a grade, for better or worse, to every Ramones release. He was listening to everything. Yeah,
people made fun of the format, but he covered so much stuff that it's a net plus. Even though it's not, it's important how the live gigs are and stuff, but the records needed that coverage, all of them really, and you just, just a few years before punk rock, I was looking at German psychedelic releases or imports and stuff, and it was very difficult to hear any of that on the radio or read anything about it. And I wrote a little bit for Rock fanzine, and they were out of Portland at the time. I think he started in Fresno, but Archie Patterson became kind of the center point of how German, French, Italian, Prague electronic stuff got known. And when I came west in '76, I looked at Rather Ripped Records, and I thought Rather Ripped and then Millennium up in Portland, they had more imports than I'd ever seen in Chicago. And I hadn't seen it in LA either, but that's the thing, if you were an advanced listener or consumer of music, you were in an area where Rolling Stone didn't matter to you anymore. It wasn't covering anything, and you were lucky if there was something like Triad in Chicago or later Slash and New York Rocker, and that all came up to serve that purpose.
I'm going to read a passage from Joe's book, Rock of the Pop Narcotic, that may ring true to some of you, whether or not you were ever in such a band. And Joe writes, for rock bands back in the late 70s, I'm going to skip a few, for sake of brevity, I'm going to edit my words here. For rock bands back in the late 70s, early 80s, resigned to dim commercial prospects, the usual tensions were present, but with new twists. And here Joe is, of course, talking about like the street level or independent level bands not signed to major label contracts with the major label systems of support. Without the cash prospects, there were no managers involved. In a band's early years, one of its members would be put in charge of getting gigs and booking tours. The others put the pressure on him while putting up with his abuse over their freeloading. If this tension and the general poverty didn't break up the band, they would proceed to the point where they had saved or borrowed enough to record themselves. Demo cassettes went out to local clubs, local press, some fanzines, and some record labels like Homestead, SST, and Enigma. Nothing would come of this, and more general pissed offness ensued. If the band didn't break up by this point, they might have collected a small audience which began to spread the word on them. In a couple of years, they might have become the toast of the local fanzine and got a good gig or two opening for touring independent label big shots. They perhaps got a small label to release their first record. It might have charted all over the nation on college radio stations and barely sold 1,000 copies. Despite criticism that he spends too much band money on the telephone, the band, quote, leader, unquote, manages to book a hodgepodge of tour dates that cover at least a few cities everybody's heard of. This first tour brings them to the point of breaking up within the first week. Hostile and incompetent sound men botch the mix on cheap PA equipment, which gets blown, so the band has to pay for it out of the door, which was shit anyway, so the promoter is stiffing them on the, quote, guarantee, unquote, to start with. The pay-to-play reality sinks in after 1 week without a motel stop, without a change of clothes, without a shower, with 3 Denny's meals each day, with a mad scramble for pot, heroin, or cocaine in each new town, with girlfriends back home threatening to jump off bridges unless they leave the tour immediately. If the van breaks down at this point, or their equipment is stolen in New York, it's usually the end, because the guy who's booked the tour has to take torrents of shit over all this for 20 hours a day and keep on doing the job. No, he doesn't. So Joe goes on to say, by the way, that if it had been this bad before, the 60s never would have happened. And here he talks about like the long established, what you might even call Tin Pan Alley structures of booking agencies and record companies and so on and so forth, as opposed to which seem to more directly connect to what we would generically refer to as the street.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah. The media evolution is kind of what shaped whether young bands got on the radio or popular, or Elvis was in the mid 50s to 57. He was he toured on a kind of a low club level in the South only, to Texas and back to Memphis, down to Louisiana for Louisiana Hayride radio live thing. And
basically following a country music circuit.
yeah, and then from that he does New York television. So that's the Dorsey Brothers and that's Steve Allen, and it's finally Ed Sullivan gives in. He at first tries to make a moral stand, like, this brutarian doesn't deserve to be on TV, on my stage. And, and it was controversial, and, everyone took one look at him and knew what he was implying. And, but anyway, he goes up and just plays out of thin air. There's no tour up to New York. I probably took the train, and he doesn't really, I think he plays an early date in Cleveland. He doesn't play Chicago till 57. That's a real tour up north, or on the road. But he's doing that after he's been on television, which I don't think television was ever important again in rock and roll history.
Really?
I mean, except as
the beat shows, Shindig, Hullabaloo, Bandstand, Midnight Special, Don Kirshner's rock concert.
Yeah, I mean, I like Foghat too, but no, it's just the media is not like that for long. Then ABC is what you're sort of talking about, both in concert, American Bandstand, the Paul Revere and the Raiders. That was a daily summer show. That was pretty.
Where the action is?
Yeah.
Where the action is.
There was It's Happening too. There was a couple of things. That was sort of, I was in Illinois and I was wearing surfer shirts and Maltese crosses, and that was all from Paul Revere and the Raiders and those beach movies and surf music. And skateboards had steel wheels, and that kind of petered out because you couldn't do much with those boards. But television in concert was important, but radio goes bad in about 74, so you could actually hear some of these, the British invasion continues in the sort of the Prague version of it into 74 when Robin Trower does records, and the Groundhogs are doing great records. There's all kinds of bands that never really got any radio in this country, and so the record stores were being asked to sort of carry these records that were released here. The labels are carrying them with no publicity. The record stores are stocking them with no publicity. There's very few people buying them. And so by 75, there's this opening because the signings stop. And with punk rock, my sense is that when I looked at my book, I found what struck me was my point about the punk era was wise to television and the media through having grown up with television, but also with Mad Magazine. And
In the book, Joe, you actually used the terms BTV, before TV, and ATV, after television,
yeah,
in its relationship to popular music, to
Yeah.
rock music.
We don't see it because we grew up with TV, but if you don't have television, the radio, the only thing before television that was really significant was probably when ASCAP pulled all of their music off of radio right after World War II. I think it was 46. And radio filled the airwaves playing records, and they were country records and blues records and unpublished music, colloquial roots music, folk music, whatever, everything, ethnic music, Polish music. And out of that came BMI, which then specialized in, they cut a deal that was better than ASCAP was demanding, and ASCAP had to cave so that published music could then be on the radio at a price of royalties. But suddenly, it's also the war, I guess, you know, the mobilization, country music, black music gets heard by Northerners in the Army, on the Army bases, and then also on the radio, suddenly on the radio, right, you know, this 10 years before Elvis. So that, it's almost, you can see the evolution of the media is as important as any folk musical tradition, because the media is putting the collision in place that causes rock and roll to come together out of R&B, country and western, because white people were not going to go into the black clubs, and the black people were not allowed into the white clubs. Elvis was running around Memphis, and Charlie Musselwhite was in black clubs in the South Side, but those guys were really rare. I mean, jazz is a little bit more of an adult scene where you could cross that line, I think, but that had to happen, and it's amazing then to then get a British echo back from all of that stuff, and but by the time you're at punk rock, the media is looking at these wise ass kids with saying, well, you know, these aren't love songs, these aren't genuinely intended, they seem like they're derisory, or, you know, there's some kind of corrosive humor. Mad Magazine made fun of everything, and the media programmers looked at that and said, well, we want to give people music they can believe in, or live vicariously through. You know, the Ramones are they're like, you know, they jumped out of the pages of Mad Magazine. They produced plenty of songs that should have been on the radio, and not a one of them were. They did 4 albums in 3 years probably, and set a template, and you know, people thought that template was over, that playing the instruments was unnecessary because, you know, in England they were turning into kind of a studio music, pop music. So the Cure, the New Order, what had been an underground became just a pop, you know, process of studio work to make a hit record. Very important style, visuals for MTV and whatever they had over there.
I'm going to read another passage about intraband dynamics from Rock and the Pop Narcotic. It's tough to be part of a band. Every band is ultimately doomed to fail. There are emotionally charged situations constantly cropping up that invite ridicule or shame, especially in a 3-against-1 scenario. A band demands of its members relationships more akin to family than to co-worker. However, the lifelong experience and accommodations developed in family relationships is lacking. And on top of the vagaries of the musician's life itself, the work involved in writing, arranging, practicing, recording, and performing music with others is more apt to bend egos than conventional jobs. Each individual player's ego is on the line to some extent at every little artistic decision. And generally, there is one dominant personality in the band, and so even the required accommodations are not equally distributed. Ideally, the dominant personality is not an absolute control freak, and the others are not frustrated leaders. Still, they should be more than simply hired guns and find stimulation and satisfaction in the massive work necessary to write, arrange, record, and perform a band's music. Joe, I also want to talk about today, you in Rock and the Pop Narcotic, and I think from almost the inception of the book, the start of the book, you talk about the music, very specifically about the music making process as you see it of a potentially great rock or important rock band, which a discussion or an analysis, which as I perceive it from reading the book, is completely free and divorced from sociological, ideological, and religious considerations. There's almost a mechanics to it. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
I was just on
I have to interrupt and say, for a starting point, you essentially put to the side the keyboard-led aggregations or groups going back to the 50s. You're not really. It's not that Jerry Lee Lewis didn't make rock and roll, but it's not the paradigm, the structural model that you're talking about.
Yeah, there's something about rock and roll that comes from the string bands of the acoustic era of music, and strings and drums, and they're tactile instruments, hands-on. Whether you're a master of the instrument or not, you are able to be expressive with the string instrument. It's harder to be expressive with a piano or an organ. You can be, but it's harder. And but as far as the band phenomenon itself, I was playing SST stuff produced by Spot yesterday morning, and we played more of the Minutemen than anybody else. And the Minutemen are, in a way, they underline the interplay between three instruments better than other bands do, because some bands are, the guitar is just chording, and riff rock gets boring and uninvolving very quickly. Whatever D. Boon was doing, it didn't involve riff rock, very often. And in a way, you could isolate each of the instruments and you wouldn't know what the song is. In a way, they're James Fotopoulos' idea of harmonics is what the Minutemen were doing, which is each instrument is a lead instrument, each instrument is a rhythm instrument, and if you separate them, the song disappears, or is like one-legged or something. It's just completely. They're finishing each other's thoughts in the arrangement, and that is hard to do by writing. In jazz, you wait for that moment for all night, and then the players get to that moment late in their communion, musical communion. That's what a friend of mine who saw a lot of Chicago blues said about Howlin' Wolf. He said the first set was just terrible. They weren't in sync at all, and then they get a little drunker. They get they start vibing, and the second set is everything you imagine seeing Howlin' Wolf on the South Side.
I had this experience myself, seeing Otis Rush, Albert King, and others, over the course of a long evening. First set, you just think like, wow, has these guys ever played these songs before? And then, comes a break, and then something comes together in some unpredictable and undefinable way. Yeah.
Yeah. It isn't exactly the song, and it's not the players individually, but when you're talking rock and roll, you're typically talking about young white guys, now girls, in garages working up something that is just at the edge of what they can pull off, and that is, it's interesting that what people want is a kind of juvenilia from those artists. They want their first couple of years of product, and if the band lasts a long time, people will humor them about their latest record, even the Rolling Stones or Bob Dylan. But what they want to hear is what they wrote and played when they didn't know what they were doing. When they were sort of crashing around in a vague fantasy of what they were hoping to do, and really kind of failing in a human way to pull it off. Once they master, they're not on the charts anymore. They're not really what people are talking about anymore. There's something, America is like a teenage culture. It's interesting to us, that age period, 15 to 25 maybe, where you look like an adult, but you're not, you're not fully a professional, which is kind of boring. Even in music, it's kind of boring. And that's difficult because musicians, you have to be kind to them, because they, if they're a lifer, they're never going to capture the imagination of anybody after their 20s are finished, no matter how good they get. I mean, you can maybe be Paul Simon, and get your records out somehow, keep writing.
Or George Clinton, who Joe, it's just as an adjunct observation, I remember George Clinton telling me in the mid-1990s, Andy, you get about 5 years in this business. Those 5 years when your records are really selling, your songs are all over the radio, your shows are selling out. He goes, anything after that is gravy.
Yeah.
Which I guess he must have been. George then went on to ride one of the longest gravy trains in musical history.
Well, I think he owned his band members' costumes and characters, didn't he?
He may
He
have.
was a cruel boss.
He may have. Yeah.
Yeah, it's sad, really, when you think about it. But the exciting music that's off the hook. I don't know. You got Tom Verlaine on the cover of one of your issues there. He was a control freak. they're one of the first, most important bands. They didn't put out their own record, but
This
it
is
was-
television, not any
Yeah.
later Tom Verlaine band.
Right.
Yep.
Well, that's what you wonder. Where is mature Tom Verlaine? There's one or two solo records. There's a television reunion record, but that's very little product. Is there a lot of unrecorded writing that he did? It's a mystery, you know. In each band, the answer is different.
Any comments, any questions? Anybody want to raise a hand? Add anything here? If you don't, it's okay. I'm going to, I was struck by an article that appeared in a full page of the New York Times on Friday, yesterday,
I saw that.
featuring or starring a group I had never heard of from England called The Last Dinner Party. If you've never heard of them, that's okay for the purposes of this discussion. And I'm just going to read a couple of paragraphs here from the start, from this article in the Times by Alex Marshall. Dateline London. One drunken evening in 2019, Abigail Morris and Georgia Davies rushed into a discount store in Brixton, South London, and bought a cheap notepad to write down their band's manifesto. At that point, the rock group, then called the Dinner Party, had 3 members and had never actually rehearsed any songs. But Morris and Davies, the singer and bassist, knew exactly how they wanted to look and sound, and these terms are in quotations. Gothic, indulgent, and decadence were at the top of their list. As the English literature students went from pub to pub, they added to their proclamation, including modest ambitions, playing shows with hip British bands, and more grandiose aims. Quote, "We want to be role models for younger girls," unquote. Joe, how is this methodology of starting a band different from what inspired or the process that was followed by the bands you worked with at SST some 40 years ago?
Yeah, it's completely different, I guess. But as they're British, it's interesting when you read the early Beatles, Rolling Stones stories. They were obsessed with the American records they heard, and they listened to them incessantly, studied them. There's very little of that in what they're talking about in that article. They do, somewhere along the line, there's a discussion of managers or agents for this band remarking on their common group obsession with the project of the band. They don't go into music. I tried to, treat music as